Good morning, and welcome to another episode of Cybersecurity Amplified and Intensified with your host, Eric Taylor, and myself, Shiva. Today, we have John Wetzel from Recorded Future, and I would like to say all opinions are our personal opinions today and do not represent those of our employers. Eric, I'll let you kick this one off since we have to make that disclosure.
Sure, we are going to talk about Afghanistan today and a lot of the tech that's there.
Although I think there is counterplay, right? I think with Afghanistan, you got to remember what the history is there. The U.S. has invested so much time, energy, and effort in a country. And it's not just about a military force there anymore. It's not like, this isn't feudal times where we just go in and it's infantry and then they're there and then they leave. You have economic resource, political resource, people on the ground, contractors. You have cyber resources that were tied up there where that becomes like where you have active warfighters in an area. That's your first priority because they're at risk constantly. You take that away and now you have resources and nobody wants to lose funding for those resources. So they're going to pivot somewhere. I think you've seen already a lot of conversation about like, where are we pivoting these resources? Where are we going to go? And it's clearly going to be Asia, particularly kind of like the Southeast Asia region where you have a active competition is probably the political sciencey way to talk about it between India and China. You have China beginning to flex and expand for resources in the South China Sea. And you have kind of a lot of cyber supported activity that's happening in those regions. And so like, when you think about like Afghanistan, it's like, oh, we're pulling out of there and it's just going to be, a return to normal. Well, there is no return to normal. It's just, we have a lot of resources. We have a huge defense budget and you have a lot of nations that are trying to figure out like, where do we direct the energies here? And where are we going to do this? And it's going to be in places where there's active competition going on.
Yeah, I mean, when you pull out, you're creating a massive vacuum. So, when the president and everybody is coming out, it's like, oh yeah, Taliban's not going to take over for a long time. Like, no, you're creating, like I said, a major effing vacuum. That thing's going to get filled in really damn quick, and we had military operations that were going out from Afghanistan for other covert operations. We weren't there just for, deploying democracy in the region. We were, leveraging other, wars or, counter military intelligence or whatever the case is from Afghanistan. So this is going to make a global effort from a military standpoint a lot harder.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point there. You have to remember that U.S. hasn't really pulled completely out of a region in a long time. Like we still have presence in Iraq, right? India, we still have presence. We still have bases in supply depots and certain islands and bases there. You have, it's very rare to see a complete military withdrawal, right? Like a complete lack of presence and place there. I think it's going to be interesting to see like where does the U.S. flex logistically. I think that's why you're probably seeing a lot of the military efforts towards like longer range or over the horizon type of weapon systems, right? Like how do we reach out and touch globally from like very, very long supply lines. And you're absolutely right about the power vacuum. I think it's important to say that while the U.S. military is completely out of Afghanistan, the U.S. is not. And I don't mean to say that like we're maintaining some kind of hidden resource there. I mean, literally, there are U.S. citizens that are still in Afghanistan. Some have stayed behind because they didn't know how to get the rest of their family out that may not be U.S. citizens. There are some that stayed behind or are actively trying to get out right now and kind of being supported by ad hoc networks of professionals trying to supply them information on how to get across borders, where checkpoints are and things like that. And there's still U.S. efforts in surrounding countries, or working through kind of other allies there with the UK and others, like in places like Uzbekistan, trying to say, hey, you get across the border here. If you get here, we'll work on getting you out to places of safety and refuge.
Yeah, the thing that really drives me nuts right now, and it literally is pissing me off, where I just want to go full on Marine Corps and just start screaming at the top of my lungs and pull Chester the Bulldog out of my ass, is the fact, with everything that we go through in boot camp, you don't leave people behind. That's one of the main things that we always get taught. No matter what, nobody gets left behind. You know, there are so many US citizens, people with American fucking passports still trying to get out of that country. And the fact that Biden is like, yeah, nothing to see here. Those are mostly just US allies or whatever. I mean, no, we have actual fucking citizens there crying out. There was just a report yesterday that one of the translators that helped Biden when he was a senator and a couple other senators when they had to make an emergency landing, that helped him and the other senators, go to safety. He's been begging Biden and the team to come out, because they're in fear of their life. Him, his wife, and 4 kids are still there, not a fucking peep. And now we're seeing on some, sketchy sites that there are US allies that are now being executed because of helping. And I don't know if that is from the whole door-to-door knocking, saying, hey, do you know anybody who's been helping the US, or if it's the whole biometric security or information that they have now.
Going back to that biometric thing, John, these are devices, and you gotta hope that operational security has been built into the asset management of these devices, right?
Yeah.
And they're remotely connecting to a database. The likelihood that anything's stored locally, what do you think?
Well, I think you're talking about a lot of, there's a lot of open questions logistically about like what got left behind, what's there. I think there's a few different elements that you have to take place there. Number one, what devices are we concerned about? A biometric device is not anything more than what a camera is, than what like a printer is, right? They're peripheral devices that are designed for a single purpose. The actual device itself, like a hide device, is really just a very fancy scanner, right? Like I've used them before. I trained them. You literally put your hand on them and they scan them in. By the way, half the time it doesn't work for a lot of different reasons that you don't think about them in the West.
But they cost so much.
Yeah, well, we think, I'll take it. I used to do like biometric entry and things like that for people that were working on bases, and the devices fail a lot. And one of the reasons they fail is because you don't think about people that are working in foreign country don't always have clean hands, right? Or people working in foreign country may have worked with their hands for a very long time. They have built up calluses on the fingertips, so they don't have that same type of like resolution that you might get from somebody who, like us, who get a privileged life. Of our, worst thing that happens is that we type on a keyboard and get a little like, carpal tunnel, right? Like these are, so like little things that cause failure over time are one of the challenges. And that's just with the endpoint device itself. Locally, there is information that does get stored in, say, like a local laptop and things like that. That's where you have some local processing that happens. You'll store up local records there. It may not need a cloud-based database because, for a lot of different reasons. Number one is when you're in a military engaged environment, you may not have strong internet connectivity. I remember talking on a previous show, you're talking about people that have backups that are still working at, dial-up connection speeds, right? Not just that. Same thing happens in conflict regions, especially, but also in regions that you don't have the same type of telecommunications maturity, right? And the third area is like kind of that cloud storage area. So where we're thinking about like massive databases of PII and things like that. You're right. Almost certainly, like once you get to that endpoint there, that we're not leaving that on for countries there. The middle point with laptop devices, most of that has likely been secured, where you're talking about like hardware devices that have been secured, databases, anything that's local there, probably that. The actual like hide device, the hide scanner, and things like that, I don't know. Apparently a lot of those have been left behind, but you need the full chain to really develop and I guess to a certain extent, weaponize that ability. You also have to have analysts. You also have a lot of time, effort, energy, and computational power to be able to do those things in a way that I think people who aren't as familiar with like military supply chains think about like the weaponization of these things. It's not easy. There's a long chain of these things there. That's not to say that it's trivial that we left behind equipment and things like that. But I do think there is a cost estimation that goes into play there of what do we leave behind? How is it going to be weaponized versus, what what do we have to prioritize in other areas to get out? Me personally, I think like definitely in like a weapon system is a lot more worrisome than a endpoint device that needs a lot of other connectivity there. And the other thing that counterbalances there is if I have to choose between a case of M16s or getting one more person out of Afghanistan, out of the most massive airlift that ever has happened in the history of the US, I'm going to choose the human. And I think that's just a cost trade-off that's really important to understand, that when you are moving that many people, which political affiliations aside, I think we have to give credit to the military for how much effort that takes to actually airlift that many people out of a single place in that short a period of time. That's a logistical performance, like just miracle. It's amazing to do that. I think like there's trade-offs that have to happen.
I don't disagree with you there, but what I do think the DoD should do is come out and say, hey, some of these devices that all these news agencies are running with, saying that are now compromised by the Taliban or whomever, they're worthless, or there's such limited data, just like you explained, John, and we're not getting that. And I think that's causing mass panic stateside. And I'm going to say 2 words here that I think are behind a lot of this, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, especially coming from Recorded Future. Active measures. Do you think they're at play?
I think that, well, there's a couple different ways. I guess my one frame would be active measures at play by whom?
Russia.
So
they created it, right? Or they're the ones who have PhDs in it.
So we have seen, I think it's on a lot of different sides there. On one hand, you have seen a lot of influx on social media from posts from Russia, as well as China as well. And there's probably others involved in it as well, but those are kind of the 2 that you're mainly seeing in big pushes that appear to be kind of taking propaganda advantage of the situation, at least the kind of like the immediate value there. We've been doing some digging as well at Recorded Future, and I'm sure there'll be some reporting that comes out about that, but I don't think that is a strategic surprise to anyone. You have, I think kind of 2 different perspectives on it as well. On one hand, with China, I think they're looking at, like, you're thinking about a nation that might be able to actually take advantage of devices. China might actually be that, right? Like, I'd be less concerned about Afghanistan holding a high device and learning to maintain a properly managed database, which, let's be honest, we all know is a whole thing in and of itself, as China, who already has those databases, saying, hey, a bunch of free devices, we'll take those off your hands. And so they get an ability to kind of focus in a different direction right now, which China is always, looking both first internally, like how do we look at our current population, what are we doing there, and then externally, how are we flexing regionally. Russia, on the other hand, I think has a different problem. Russia has a history in Afghanistan, right? Like Russia has vested concerns and resources with that, and they've never had like full control. How much are they going to be able to, work with the Taliban? And I think you start seeing some political movement there where they're already screaming that the US should, and other European countries mainly, should not hold Afghanistan to the same human rights standard that we would like to, which is kind of, a flex in and of itself. I think that you're also seeing Russia trying to be concerned as well. Like there's, they have a history in Afghanistan. They have a history in in a country that's on their periphery there. And how do they look at that? What do they view as being concerning there? Because Russia is not a innocent bystander to this stuff either. They are actively concerned at what's going to happen anywhere in the periphery. And it could be a pain point for them in future years.
So when you talk about China, we talk about some of these other things. The thing that really, comes to my mind is China is already doing to Afghanistan what they've done to South Africa and other parts. And I forget the name of the program. I was trying to look it up real good, on Google, but the name is evading me. The China government essentially leases and sells their infrastructure to third world countries to build up the technology, and they're data mining all that stuff. So China's already doing this. They're already engaging, and potentially will start, if that deal goes through by the end of the year, China's going to be standing up. So you have that, you have legacy or quote unquote legacy or somewhat decommission technology that's still there. So China's able to potentially get their hands on and start reverse engineering our tech. I just look at this as a massive honest fucking failure.
Well, I think what you got to realize is a lot of this gear that was left behind, John, correct me if I'm wrong here, if you can, is gear that was given, I use that term loosely, to the Afghan army. That's a lot of what the Taliban has taken over since they're now in control, or seemingly in control. What's the likelihood that the US would leave high-level competency gear or give high-level competency gear to the Afghan army that's on par with what we use internally?
Well, one, I guess, depends on how what do you consider high-level competency gear, right?
Communications equipment in a Black Hawk.
Yeah,
is it going to be the most up-to-date stuff that we're using, or is it going to be a generation or 2 or 3 behind?
Yeah, it's never going to be anything that networks with systems that we can use to fully compromise it, right? Like even when we were in Iraq, like we had a system called Blue Force Tracker, which if you use Blue Force Tracker, you have things to say about it. But that was not something that was ever given to like Iraqi army, right? Like there's bridge networks there because those are logistical systems that I think create 2 versions of vulnerabilities. One, we don't ever want that system in itself be compromised. Number 2, we don't ever want someone to be able to study it reverse and use it to like affect or get into like our network systems. Now, when you think about high competency, I think we're worried about like, I saw a bunch of people saying like the number of Humvees and the number of like, body armor, the number of like, weapons that are being used there. I do think those are tragedies. I don't like seeing Taliban soldiers with a bunch of U.S. military uniforms, U.S. military weapons, and those things. That to me strikes very close to home of, that anger center, because, I have friends, I have, units that have, I guess, play it lightly, suffered quite a bit from that. And that just hurts an emotional center. I think strategically it's less significant because, they can't be connected, right? Like anyone who's ever maintained any piece of weaponry in the United States military knows those systems break. Like the M4 rifles are not like the world's most sophisticated things in the world. Like they jam, they get dirt in them. They're really actually painful to keep clean. I used to drive around. Well, it was a 998, so like 998, and then it was I think it was a 1024. Sorry, 1113. Those are versions of Humvees, and those are really painful to maintain. One, because of the things that we've done to them. You think of like an up armored Humvee that can survive an IED attack as being the latest greatest thing. Well, no, you've added on 10,000 pounds of extra weight, and anybody who's ever tried to haul a trailer with a souped up SUV knows they're not prepared for that, and they will break down very quickly if you're not like fully trained. And what are all of the lubrication points on a Humvee? You don't think of stuff like that, but those become really important when you're maintaining like complex mechanical systems. On the electrical component side, I think we've done a really good job at making sure that, we've stopped that. I would probably contest the point that China is going to come in and reverse engineer, or even have a lot of value at reverse engineering our stuff, because a lot of the devices weren't really that sophisticated. Most high devices you can actually get, they're part of a DoD program called COTS, right? It's commercial off-the-shelf technology. And so, if it was gotten, they've already gotten it, right? Like they've had availability for this. And that was, I think, one of the intents and maybe a non-targeted benefit of having that type of commercial off-the-shelf program with Department of Defense, where they went out and massively bought whatever devices they could before custom building more things, was that it's not as valuable anymore to capture some of those things. I'm like, even when you get into sophisticated communication systems, SINGAR's technology, those are the radios that, by the way, are very old, but free copy technology. Most of those have been burned and gone through. But even if you happen to capture one, which I'm fairly certain somewhere, so like somebody has gotten access to one of those, the way that they're networked and the way they're worked is that they rely on encryption devices that are timely, that worry about, hey, this rotates every so long period of time. So I think it's like we've instructed a lot of people in network security. There's a lot of layers in defense and depth. Compromising the hardware is purposely thought out so that you don't compromise the full integrity of the network, even if a hardware device is lost.
But do you think when you're looking at this from at least what's being publicly discussed, what appears to be the lack of freaking planning by our government, the last minute pullout of things, where there's been open discussions where some Blackhawks were disabled, but they didn't get to them all. Do you think that there was proper due diligence done in dismantling a lot of this tech to make sure that people can't reverse engineer this stuff? I mean, take away from, separation of generation of the technology. I just don't want any of even our legacy technology to be able to be reverse engineered and potentially find, a back door somewhere. I mean, just as well as I do that, we can, especially when I'm doing pen tests, sometimes we could stumble across a GitHub repo with legacy APIs that are still freaking working. Some of that stuff could have some nuggets of information. That's what I'm really worried about.
Yeah, and I think that's always a concern. With something like a Blackhawk, which it's hard for me to say that name out loud because when I was in Iraq, we affectionately or unaffectionately called them Crash Hawks.
Yeah.
But think about that. I think about the full stream of that technology. On one hand, it's a mechanical system. It's not new. It's been around for a while. The mechanical system I'm less concerned about than I am about electronic warfare systems that are on there, like radios that are on there. Most of those have been removed and, you don't have to worry about. Electronic warfare gets in a little bit more interesting when you're talking about frequency blocking and the types of defensive measures those things have on them. Those are probably the systems that I'd be most critically concerned about. The mechanical systems, I'm guessing, and this is just a sheer guess, would be the ones that probably the last things that you disable on it because they can take a little bit of time. I do think that there's kind of two different areas that I probably would principally mainly concerned with what happens with those systems. The first one is the reverse engineering of the technology. Less so about innovation and more so about weaknesses and targeting, right? Oh, hey, we looked at this structurally. If you hit it here as opposed to here, maybe there's an advantage towards that. And those to me, there's slight value that's gained and an awful lot of effort and energy that's taxed in there. And they may have been able to discover those earlier on, right? You can look at blueprints and diagrams and get a pretty good understanding of what it is. And we know that China has been very active in being able to study those, being able to acquire through economic espionage programs, a lot of that technology. The other thing that I think is interesting is the kind of the funneling of that infrastructure later on. Let's take a Blackhawk, you break it down. Some of it might be ITAR technology, some of it might not be, but it might not be the electronics that I'm really concerned about. It's the repair and maintenance of those programs over time. And I think about that in terms of countries that we have embargoed that maybe we're helping giving them a new supply of stuff that they need to just maintain old fleets. So if you look at a country like Iran, for example, I'm bringing this back to Afghanistan, but you look at a country like Iran has had a lot of legacy U.S. stuff. And again, a lot of it was acquired from the U.S. back in the 70s. They needed to maintain and upgrade those things. And over time, they managed to get some of it. But Iraq got so desperate at one point, they would actually buy up trash from depots or at least attempt to buy trash of depots, especially airplane depots in the West U.S. because they wanted to get it shipped over to Iran so they could sort through it, find the parts to be able to maintain their own the aircraft there. I worry about stuff like that. Let's say there's countries that we once did business with, no longer do business with, that have, Black Hawk helicopters they need to maintain, and they can't do that. So some of them are not being serviced. Now they have a brand new supply depot of stuff that they might be able to get to, supply them. Again, I think that's, by the way, very likely to happen, but strategically, is that the worst thing in the world counterbalanced against other things? I don't know. I'm not paid to think at that level, but I do think to me, those kind of tragedies are where it happens there. Again, I don't want to see a U.S. weapon system ever used against the U.S., period. But I think if you look at the history of that, that's just how technology and warfare happens. I mean, you want to talk about a weapon system that they never wanted to see spread as far out the globe as they did, was probably when you look at the classic example of Russia and the AK-47, right? That's everywhere. There's nowhere that Russia ever got into combat ever that they weren't getting shot at by their own either weapons or, fun story, counterfeits of their weapons made by the Chinese. So,
Chinese don't counterfeit weapons. What are you talking about? That never happens. Come on. It's not like the ARM chips that are going on with China right now.
So Shiva hinted to something that I don't know if it really got fully answered. So I want to definitely circle back because another side of me really does think that this may be a counter-military intelligence ploy. So, when, Obama was president, they did the whole gun running and everything for Mexico just to help track and find where the guns ended up and track cartels and all that. But part of me does want to think that maybe some of this stuff was left behind in a somewhat operational state to see, okay, what the hell does the Taliban actually do with this shit? Because a lot of people have said, this Taliban is not the same Taliban from 9/11, right? So it's a different organization. They have a different mindset. So, we do have bases close enough, and I'm sure there's drones flying over there all the time, just keeping an eye on shit. But do you think this could be, the U.S. government just doing their own onusing on the Taliban and gaining intel that way? That's why these things were left behind.
Maybe, right? Like, I mean, that certainly, this is where you get in one of those areas that I know just enough to be dangerous. So let me just say this. I think there's always operational considerations at play, right? I think one of the things that's unique though, is that you're absolutely right. This isn't the Taliban that we had in 9/11. And even that one, I think, that one was probably one more of a consolidated whole where you've already seen, I think probably the clearest example is the bombing the suicide bombing at HKIA that resulted in 13 American deaths and hundreds of other casualties there. That was almost immediately condemned by the Taliban itself. And I'm not saying they're good guys in the larger picture here. I'm saying that shows that there's this fractionalization that's happened there where the Taliban, even on their own accord, don't view themselves as the most extreme element in their own caucus, right? Number two, they view themselves as trying to want to portray something else on a larger world stage. We don't yet know what that is. We're very cautious about being anywhere near optimistic, especially given their operational history and given their tendencies towards certain types of behaviors and human rights violations. But the Taliban of 9/11 vehemently hated the internet. One of the first things they did is came in there and took everything down. We haven't seen that kind of activity yet. We've seen that they actually have their own website, right? You have the Taliban that used to be kind of this ruling governing type of thing, and it had a very clear vision of society, and we don't necessarily see exactly what that is anymore. I think they're going to have a lot of internal problems and struggles as they continue on in figuring out like exactly who do we partner with. Like they may not love, you got to remember on either side, they have Iran on one side, they have Russia interfering on the other, and they have history with that. And then they have China on the other side. So I think they're very cautiously feeling out like what happens there. They were not conciliatory towards the US as well. They laid down very hard lines, but at the other hand there, you have to remember in the end stages of the pullout, the Taliban were providing security for HKIA, whether you have, you can have like opinions on whether you think that was real security, if they let people in and other things there. But on paper, they were doing that. They were communicating with US military commanders on the ground there. Those were things that were actually happening. So I think that shows like they were at least somewhat conciliatory towards like, what does this look like? How do we maintain order and structure here? So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think the final thing to that point of like, what kind of intelligence gathering does the US need? I think you ultimately have this question of they're not a closed country, right? Like Afghanistan and the Taliban haven't yet, decided exactly what they want to do. We don't see that they're going full on like North Korea, like let's cut ourselves completely off from the world. So that always leaves open this possibility of like, what exactly are they going to try and do? How are they actually going to structure things? How are they actually going to bring things and partner it? It may not be a partnership. It may not be things that we in the US view in the best and brightest light here. And even the citizens of Afghanistan are terrified. And I don't want to trivialize that. But I think it'll be interesting to see exactly what happens there. And that opens up obviously intelligence opportunities there to be, at least understood, if not exploited.
One thing I do want to say is if we alienate the Taliban, they are just going to gravitate towards people who oppose us, whether that's China, whether that's Russia, regardless of what China and Russia are doing to them. So it's in our best interest to have a discourse with them to be a part of how they want to rebuild, or at least not interfere to that degree. At least that's what I think.
One of those things, keep your enemies close, but your enemies closer.
Yeah.
Well, but just don't push them towards your enemies. I mean, I think that's really the basis of what any type of collaboration would be. And CNBC ran a story that the Pentagon stated exactly what John said. Taliban was helping with the evacuation effort, keeping order, whatever that means to whomever. And the reason I brought up active measures before is I think we are, as a country, in a really interesting place where it's easy to divide the left from the right. And people forget that, yeah, you could be on the left, you could be on the right, but you're still an American. And I think that should be the overarching thing that governs us. At least that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I think internationally, it plays an even more important role there. Like, Eric, to your point, I kind of, in my mind, I guess in my fiercest, alcohol-fueled, like, anger sessions, I do want there to be something approaching like Pax Romana, right? Like, Pax Romana was this idea that in the Roman Empire, and even then it had challenges, but in the Roman Empire, a Roman citizen could literally walk anywhere and all they would have to say is that I'm a Roman citizen, and nobody would touch that because they knew that if you killed one Roman citizen, you risk bringing the entire threat of the Roman Empire down onto you. I like that. I like that idea, but even in Roman times, that had its own challenges there. And I think in the geopolitical climate that we're in order to really secure an American nation, you have to think about, like, all right, how do we work inside of this international space, particularly in regions or with countries that we may not entirely agree with. And I think that's really hard in a very politically charged environment where we want countries to 100% fall in line with what American view of democracy is and how do we do that. And we want countries to, like, 100% fall in line with what the American view of, like, human rights are, and, like, vehemently go after nations that aren't. Well, I get that, and I want that as well, but you also have to bring that into realities. And if you look at the past history of U.S. Operating globally, there's been a lot of challenges where we've been forced to choose between kind of two evils, and which do you work with? But how do you work that and partner with that in a way that's below active conflict to try and figure out how do we make this work so that the whole of the U.S. is actually maintained? And I think sometimes that does mean that we have to make deals with the devil in places like, like Afghanistan, or with other countries that may border. I mean, you got to remember, countries that border that much influence there are strategically important. I always think about, like, Azerbaijan. You have Europe on one hand, you have Iran on the other, you have Russia on the other. Those are really strategically important countries that maybe we don't think enough about when you're thinking about, like, all right, great, Russia has oil or natural gas. Where are they putting that pipeline for that through?
Germany.
Where are they, moving networks through? How are they doing that? Germany
around the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
But let's not talk about that because that makes too much sense to talk about, right? One thing I'd like to pivot to, and I know this is not in line with the Afghanistan thing, is China and the ARM chips. I don't know if you're read up on that, John. You wanted to discuss that.
Not as well educated on as I probably should be. I guess, like, which area of that do you want to take on?
Nortel Part 2.
Oh.
And for those of you that don't know about that, Highway, or Huawei as they call it, basically reverse engineered Nortel gear and started producing it on their own, selling it. I think compromised it to other countries and were able to get in. But on a low level, a Chinese firm took over 51% of the company of ARM Holdings, which controls the IP for the chips that most everything is based off of. And they just spun it out into their own company and took over the IP. Am I off base on that?
I believe that's correct, yeah.
Yeah. So now, again, China is in control, or a Chinese company is in control of IP for stuff we use, and they could, I'm pretty sure, come around and put a tax on it or a royalty charge on there, depending on how it's structured. And that could potentially compromise our ability to manufacture chips, even if we want to do it domestically.
So chip manufacturing is a whole world there. By the way, talk about the pivot. Our California to like, semiconductor processing and foundries. Like that was masterful. I appreciate that.
We try.
So I don't know. Hardware manufacturing is a whole thing. And by that, I mean, like when you're talking about semiconductors, you're talking about like, I think people, if you're not as familiar with semiconductor manufacturing, you may just think like, oh, hey, these are just things that come out like or maybe you don't put that much thought into it. But I guess there's a couple of things. One, there's two basic types of chips. You have FPGAs, and then you have ASIC chips. ASICs are like custom made, they're printed. That's like what's inside of your iPhone. And then you have FPGAs, which are field programmable gate arrays. And those are kind of like I don't know. It's like a Toyota, like a Chevy chassis that they put into like 18 different cars, right? You can build a lot of different things on them for a lot of different purposes, right? When you're talking about how chips are made, number one, the vast majority of them are made over in, I guess I'll just roughly put Asia around it, but China, Taiwan, some are manufactured now in Vietnam and others, sub-Asian continent there, but like mainly over in that region of the space. There's a lot of history, there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of economics that go into why that exists, but the majority of them are made over there. That doesn't mean that there is no chip manufacturing capability in the United States. There are still companies that do substantial business in that. They just don't necessarily do it in the volume, and it doesn't end up as many consumer products as the volume of semiconductors that are manufactured over in Asia. You saw some of that with like, there's some, I'm not going to name names, but there's like large manufacturers in Taiwan that due to COVID ended up not being able to produce much. There's large centers in China. I think there was one, if I remember correctly, I could be getting this one wrong. I think there was a semiconductor plant somewhere near Wuhan in China that was heavily affected during COVID, had to shut down, and then it caused, massive supply chain disruptions. Around the same like level of supply chain disruptions. Apparently one boat getting stuck in a canal in Egypt can cause, but like that's a whole other thing.
I don't think that was an accident, but
when we're talking about, supply chain security, I think there's a couple elements at play here. Number one, it's really, 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 really hard to figure out whether or not somebody put an implant into a hardware chip. Like it's just really hard. Part of that is just how they're manufactured. You have layers of chips. Like what you look at on the surface has like a bunch of connectors and stuff like that. There's actually several layers of connectors that go into manufacturing a chip. Like the wafer itself has multiple layers that are printed. And then another layer is put on top, another layer is put on top, another layer is put on top. So the little transistors and things that you may have played around with from Radio Shack, there's actually a lot more like complicated system below that make these kind of hard to figure out. Once they're glued together, you can't unpeel them. So like, is there secret traces in there? Are there other things that we need to be concerned about? Number two, they're still at the high end, flipping over to the other side, there are still this program called Trusted Foundry in the United States, which are basically firms that can still manufacture semiconductor chips. They don't do it nearly as cost efficiently as other places, but for very, very critical sensitive applications, we go to that company. They have a lot of security protocols. They print out a lifetime buy of that chip for some company. And then those are like, we have a lot more confidence that, hey, this is everything that we need for that. These are guaranteed, or as much as the US government can say, like, hey, we've done this. And then the US government comes in and basically buys out the full lifetime supply of that. And by lifetime, I don't mean like, hey, this will last as long as this device ends. It says, hey, how many of these are we going to need for service repair for anything over the course of the next 30 years? Let's buy that many, have them printed off at one time. And then, that company can go on manufacturing whatever else they have. That program has shrunk over the years because the number of semiconductor companies in the United States has shrunk as well. I think that's where you start getting into like supply chain concerns of like, what happens there? How are we going to get back? What's going on there? And there's also no like problem with IP there because they are, going into really, really sensitive applications there.
But IP in terms of the ARM chips, if China controls that and shuts us off or throttles us, what do you think the economic challenges would be?
I think that's if that happens, they're going to be economic consequences are going to be devastating, but they're going to be devastating for all of us. And I think that's the one thing there. There's always been this overlying concern amongst circles of like, what happens if China calls back all of its U.S. debt? Does all of the like U.S. debt, like the treasury bills and other things
that devalues their holdings and their assets? Where I see the weaponization of IP is if we begin to move production of these chips away from China. I think that's when China's going to flex and say, hey guys, hold up. We own the IP. If you want to produce here, you're going to have to pay a higher licensing fee. If you produce it in China and we get your foreign exchange, then it's the status quo.
Yeah, but how does that work? Right? How does that work? Hey, let's say an administration comes in and says, you're no longer going to be producing semiconductor chips in China. Just like
almost happened last year. Well, last administration.
Yeah, but why didn't it? It's because basically every major company, which by the way gives lots of money to every political party always, come in and says, if you do this, you're destroying our business.
Right.
You're absolutely destroying our business because we do not have viable places to get these chips. We just don't exist. I do think I don't want to trivialize the fact that, these moves happen and that China has continually, like some of them are through things like the Digital Road Initiative, which Eric, you might have been talking to before, either Digital Road or Digital Silk Road Initiative or things like United Workfront, where they tried to expand power there. I think this is another extension of that. I don't love that any one nation controls that much of a particular IP or product. That being said, the products have been out there. The manufacturing is what I get concerned about. Because the manufacturing can say, hey, let's lead into continuing the supply, but let's add in a little, that's always been the major concern for DoD. Let's add in a little bit of our extra stuff so that we can tell what you're doing, or we have an ability to weaken it so that maybe we can get into it later. But I think like large scale moves, like economic moves, things like that, I don't see as likely because it would be Pyrrhic war, right? It would literally it destroys us and it destroys them. It destroys kind of the world economy and does a lot of things that
I think it destroys us more because we have the moral high ground and we go after them for IP infringement and all this other stuff. So if they say, hey, we own the IP, they're kind of making us to be hypocrites. Not that anyone cares, quite honestly.
What are they going to do? They have to go after, it's not like the companies in the US are the ones the only ones that do it, right? Like we also you'd have to enforce that globally, right? You'd have to go after Europe. You'd have to go after any of these other like substantial manufacturers. And ultimately you might have, like, if they tried to unilaterally enforce it on a single country, you might have an organization like WTO come in and be like, yeah, they don't have to comply by that. And then basically it's kind of like a speed limit in traffic, right? Like a speed limit may be posted, but if nobody follows it, is that really the speed limit? Then,
True. But then it puts us off center on what we say we do, right? As a country.
We're off center on a lot of things, what we say we do. So
the other implication here is, and I haven't read up on this much, is Alibaba, one of the board seats now belongs to the Chinese party. Are you familiar with that?
I mean, that's been kind of every Chinese most companies. The fact the U.S. government does not actively hold board seats on most of its major companies is a thing that's really unique around the world. It's really, really unique around the world. Russia has joint stock companies where the Russian government owns part of it, and then there's a civilian group owns of it. China, we actively assume, because their structure is so obfuscated, it's really hard. Once you get to the top, if you ever want to just go down an absolute rabbit hole, try to find out what the board of directors of Tencent looks like. Try to find out what the board of directors on any Chinese-based company looks like, and it rapidly goes down a rabbit hole of we don't really know. Their leadership gets so obfuscated there, and who owns what shares and how they're controlled, because the active assumption is that the Chinese government owns half of every company there anyhow, or at least it owns a substantial stake in a lot of these organizations.
But don't you think that changes the game when they outright say, hey, we're on this board right now? And I think that's more for them to flex their power on the Jack Ma's.
Yep. I think it's less about us and it's more about them. Right. I think it's less about I think China makes a public move like that less to because they're like, we want to show US that we can do it. I think it's more so like, hey, you guys are in our country. You get too far out of line. This is what we start doing. And very publicly, this is what we start doing.
You know, earlier you mentioned Vietnam, and another pivot, sorry. But I've been noticing a lot of manufacturing go there, but more importantly, a lot of foreign investment. Is that something that Recorded Future tracks or not really?
So over the past year, we've written a number of reports that are kind of mapping out and looking at principally focused around China and investment and engagement. I guess you can call it about like kind of mapping the soft power there. And we're not the only ones that do this. There's a lot of other organizations that have done really, really good work at kind of tracking like things like, Digital Silk Road Initiative. Where is China spending money? How are they flexing in? Like, where are these foreign money going? I think that it's not just limited to Vietnam. It's not just limited to areas like, early on the call, we were talking about like areas in the Caribbean, right? I think like people generally in the United States don't appreciate exactly how much foreign money, particularly like, let's just say Chinese money, sometimes Russian money. Russia's a little slower at this, but China's been very aggressive at sending out a lot of foreign money in terms of loans, in terms of business deals, in terms of leased infrastructure, whether it's telecommunications devices and other things, to areas where it wants to make substantial investments. And they have been particularly heavy at doing that in areas where they think that they can flex influence in the future. Places like Vietnam, they've done, I've seen some of the same things that are happening there that they do very, very actively in places like sub-Saharan Africa, even in South America. There's a lot of infrastructure over there. So I don't think it's certainly not something that's new. It's certainly something that is concerning for the long-term implications, but it's kind of hard to grasp when you think about terms of like, what's immediate, right? Like it doesn't have an immediate grasp. It's a very long term. It's like a 20-year play, but it ends up with a lot of power being consolidated in certain countries.
But don't you think that's our biggest problem? We play the short game while they have been playing the long game, and it's really coming home to roost now.
I don't know if it's our biggest problem. I certainly think I certainly think that's one of the strategic challenges of the form of government that we've chosen is that particularly in a increasingly fractured society or viewpoint society where people are increasingly going to push towards margins of beliefs, and more importantly, push towards believing that their marginal view is the view. There's no middle ground. There is no compromise because that can affect your integrity. Is that then when you do have changeover in forms of government, it happens on a tempo. Like we really change over. Everyone says like we change over government every 4 years. No. We change over an executive every 4 years. We change over our government every 2, which means that realistically,
I think we get on any government cycle. I think we get 8 months of governing, and the rest is campaigning. And we're going up against the Xis or the Putins who are in power for 10, 20, 30 years, and it's really hard to keep focus when it's a new government or it's a new mix.
I think that becomes one of the challenges, especially when you look at massive administration turnover. And when I say massive administration turnover is the way the US government is really built is that there's a couple different tranches. You're trying to separate out operational layer responsibilities and long-term planning away from top-level prioritization and executive leadership. And the way it's been designed and functionally worked for a long time up until right around, you could argue that the Trump administration was really one of the first ones to really get in there, but it probably happened, like there were a lot of leading points up to before that was that you have kind of like a group of operators, a group of people that are director level in administrations that don't turn over. They're not political appointees. And that is a lot of your, what you consider, like they're called SES or Senior Executive Service inside of government, SIS and intelligence services and things like that. These are civilians who have they started off as a GS scale. They rose up. They got to an executive level. They are the directors of agencies. They are the directors of like all of the organizations you might think of it be affiliated with government. Above them sit the political appointees, people that are this cabinet level secretaries, sub-cabinet level secretaries. So the thought process is that you can change over a Secretary of Defense, you can change over an Undersecretary of Defense, but the people that are actually doing the real work and planning below them are staying in place, and they're the ones that structure. Now, administration prior to like administration 20 years ago, I don't want to get in politics, so I don't want to start naming off the administration, but some have come in there and said, hey, this service has gotten old. We need to clear them out, or we need to minimize them, or we need to do other things there for good and bad reasons. And then you have others that come in and saying, hey, we need to flex and put in people in these SES cores because they're the people that are actually doing things and writing things there. And I think as you started seeing administrations feeling more comfortable with figuring out like, hey, how do we minimize, or how do we get our people into this operational core, then you start thinking about like, all right, how are we starting to get more short-term thinking baked into a structure that it becomes a little bit more concerning, a little harder to maneuver, right?
Right. Eric, anything you want to add in?
Nah, John's been hammering the good points, man. There's a lot to, digest and take in and stuff like that. It's always great to have John on here just to like lobby up the question and sit back and just soak it all up, man. It's awesome.
One thing I do want to request of Recorded Future is for you guys to do something on this topic we discussed about the tech left behind, because I just think you guys have a much broader reach than we do. For now, we will overtake you one day in the podcast. Probably not, but whatever. Is that I think there's a lot of disinformation out there that is creating even more disharmony amongst us in the US. And I feel like someone should take a stand and say, let's really assess all the news out there, fake, real, whatever, and help people understand what was left behind and the type of impact it could make.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that I've been kind of trying to piece together for a little bit, is a clear assessment of really what is involved with Afghanistan. Like, what do we have to look for there? Like, what's actually going on there? I think there's a couple different levels. Like, politically, geopolitically, it's the right move to pull resources back. I probably would have argued that we should have done it, to Eric's point, in a very different way. But, getting those resources out and figuring out how do we actually do it in a way that is structurally sound is critical, because we need to be focusing on other regions of the world right now. Particularly, I would say, Southeast Asia and the kind of boiling pot that the South China Sea has become is important. And when you look at kind of Russian influence in particularly everyone talks about Ukraine, but I worry about places like Estonia, and I worry about like Russian infrastructure in like natural gas pipeline flexing, right? Like with Germany and other areas there. I think those are critically important in figuring out like how do we deal with those regions of the world is going to become like the next prioritization there. Like, you get below that operationally, I think that Afghanistan was a time suck. It was, you're sacrificing American lives, and, like many veterans, I have asked myself the question of like, what do we do? I have to fall back on the default answer of, we did things that were important over there to try and keep conflict over there and away from the United States. I think there's counter arguments to that, which are, I think, I don't think anyone understands as much as a veteran does, who's, been in these conflict regions, been sucked into there, and thinking about like, all right, yeah, it kept conflict over there, but then you pair, conflict. You hear like politicians say statements like, oh, that's not really an effective measure of power anymore. Logically, that may be true, but then why did I go over there and serve and do things, right? And those are hard statements there. And then, I think at the bottom layer, you really do have this challenge of a very human struggle. There are people that are still going to be trying to get out of Afghanistan for a while. What is going to actually happen on the ground? There is a lot of uncertainty with what the government is doing. I've heard anecdotal tales of individuals getting stopped on pathways at checkpoints as they're trying to make their way out of the country, going through having their phone pulled out of their pocket, going through calling up numbers on there. If somebody who speaks English answers the phone, that person gets shot. Right? Like, those are horrific tales. There's a very real human cost there that we have to think about. And what does that look like for not just the people that are struggling to get out, but the people that are struggling to rebuild? A lot of countries around the world are going to have this influx of refugees, the United States included, that they have no infrastructure. They may not have networks there. How are they going to get What are they going to do in 2 years when their basic attempts and time to get a green card starts expiring? Where are they going to go? How are they going to do it? Are they able to get an education system? So I think there's this responsibility there at a very human level to figure out, like, what are we going to do? How are we going to operate? And how are we going to maintain a sense of connection with this place that we've spent the last 20 years in? Whether you can argue about how we got in there, what we did, how we're going to get out, it's a very real place that has a lot of weight for many, many of us.
Yeah, I really think, like you said, but I think we're knocked back on our heels a little bit. I don't think we're standing, boot strong there, that really have a clear path going forward, because it was really a political stance where hell or high water, we will be out this date, and damn the consequences. So that's just my opinion, though. What
I think we can come back from it, though. I think we're strong enough.
There's not a question about coming back from it for me.
Or learning from it. Sorry, maybe that's the better term.
I don't know. I mean, geez, I'm not going to go down that path because we're going to go into a massive different pivot that I'm sure John does not want to go down today. But I'm just saying, look at the history of what's been happening in the country for the past couple of years. I don't think many people really learn from history anymore like we used to.
Oh, there's too much information out there. Information is too accessible, and there's too many versions of the same topic out there.
The too many versions. And
good, real, fake, and everything in between. So for whoever's listening, just buy your intelligence from Recorded Future. Call it a day. They're always right sometimes.
70% of the time, we're right every time.
There you go.
So a clock is a broken clock's right twice a day, right?
With that, sorry, go John.
No, I was just gonna say, I really do appreciate the being able to come on and talk, and I think it's, Eric, I feel you. There's a lot of things that personally I will say I'm still trying to unwrap in my mind about what happened, what did we do, what's value and worth, and I think those are ever enduring struggles for everyone, particularly for veterans right now, and so yeah, I feel you.
The biggest thing, even from a veteran standpoint, if somebody would just come out and just openly answer questions, and if it's classified or is part of operational integrity, just say, because of ongoing operations, we're not allowed to answer that question right now. Perfect, got it. You've clearly stated you've got something going on. I'm okay with that. But the fact that somebody's not coming out and, doing the quote unquote, I plead the Fifth Amendment because, we got crap going on, is really discerning. It's really putting way more questions, at least in my mind, and I think a lot of other people's minds, especially veterans, like, what the fuck is going on? And why is nobody answering questions?
Oh, some of that could be OPSEC, Eric. They don't want to admit something's going on, but I think in the case of the stuff that was left behind, the tech, the gear, someone from DOD or the government should come and say, this is why we're not worried about it, because there's a lot of disinformation around that stuff right now.
So, I always go back to, any sort of, I don't want to, make this pivot, but, if you're in an active shooter situation or you've got some sort of crime situation going on, the police will simply say, we cannot comment because of an active investigation. And everybody's okay with that. Why can we not do that with this? That's just my question.
Hey, we'll find out in 15 years when things get unclassified. Maybe. And they can write the story they want.
Mm-hmm. And we'll have 13 different versions of that too. But anyway.
Then it'll be a history book, which, to Eric's point, I don't know if somebody's going to read.
Wait, did we win? Because only the winners get to write history.
Are there winners anymore? See, we can go off. We can say
participate for everyone.
Well, John would get this. Are we allowed to salute like this, or do we have to start saluting like this? And the people who don't know, people who have never lost a war show the palm or show their forehand in a salute. If you've lost a war, you show your palm in a salute. So, but
I
anyway.
did not know that. Okay.
Mhm.
Alrighty. With that, I would like to thank John for coming on today. And it's always fun having you on and getting to learn from you. Eric, anything else?
Nope. That's it for now. Thanks for so much for tuning in, everybody. Again, thanks to John. If you have made it to the end of this podcast, thank you so much for putting up with a really, really long version of it. We really hope you enjoyed it. Please go to amplifiedandintensified.com. Spread the word. Tell about us to your friends. And if I could talk this thing through, it would be great. Until next time, y'all take care.